The clock on Michael Chen's dashboard read 11:37 p.m. as he rubbed his tired eyes. Another late night at the U.S. Attorney's office had left him drained, but the case files scattered across his passenger seat were worth the effort. After 3 months of painstaking work, his team was finally making progress on their investigation into police misconduct across several precincts in the city. Michael adjusted his tie and turned down the radio as he drove through the quiet streets toward home. All he wanted now was a hot shower in his bed. The steady rhythm of streetlights passing overhead almost lulled him into a trance when sudden flashing blue and red lights jolted him fully awake. What the? Michael checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His turn signal had been on when he changed lanes. He couldn't think of any traffic law he might have broken. With a sigh, he signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. Force of habit made him reach for his wallet even before the police car came to a complete stop behind him. As an assistant U.S. attorney, he'd been through enough training sessions to know exactly how to handle traffic stops. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, be respectful. Michael rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they could be easily seen. In his rearview mirror, he watched as 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. Something about their body language put him on edge immediately. They weren't approaching with the usual cautious professionalism he was used to seeing. Instead, they swaggered up to his car, flashlights pointed directly at his face. "License and registration," the taller officer demanded without preamble. No explanation for the stop, no greeting, just an abrupt command. "Of course, officer," Michael replied evenly. "My wallet is in my inside jacket pocket and my registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." "Just hurry up," the second officer cut in, his flashlight beam scanning the interior of Michael's car, lingering on the stack of legal documents on the passenger seat. Michael carefully retrieved his driver's license and his federal credentials, then reached across to the glove compartment for his registration. The officer's tension was palpable, making his own heart rate tick up despite his innocence. "Here you go," Michael said, handing over the requested items. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The taller officer, whose nameplate read Officer Reynolds, glanced at the license briefly before his eyes narrowed at the federal prosecutor badge and ID card. Well, what do we have here?" Reynolds said with unmistakable sarcasm. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen. That's a fancy title." "Yes, sir, I work out of the downtown office. I'm heading home from work now." The second officer, Officer Graves, according to his uniform, snorted. "Yeah, we've heard that one before. You'd be surprised how many federal agents and important lawyers we pull over after midnight." Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "You can call my supervisor to verify my identity. Her number is on my business card in my wallet." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Reynolds replied, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And I bet that card is very official looking too." Michael noticed neither officer had yet to mention why they'd pulled him over. The encounter was quickly veering away from standard procedure. "Officers, I still don't know why I was stopped. Could you please explain the reason?" Reynolds handed the documents to Graves, who studied them with obvious skepticism. "Your taillight is out," Reynolds finally stated. Michael frowned. "That's strange. I had my car serviced just last week. Are you calling me a liar?" Reynolds' voice hardened. "No, sir, I'm just surprised, that's all." Graves handed the documents back to Reynolds rather than returning them to Michael. "So you expect us to believe you're some big-shot federal prosecutor?" "It's the truth," Michael said simply. "Right. And I'm the Attorney General," Graves laughed. "Step out of the car, please." Michael felt the first real flicker of alarm. "May I ask why? I've provided my identification and—" "Step out of the car now." Reynolds cut him off, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon. Michael's legal training kicked in. He knew his rights, but he also knew that roadside arguments with police rarely ended well, especially for men who looked like him. He'd prosecuted enough civil rights cases to understand the realities of the system. "I'm going to comply," Michael said clearly, "but I want to note that I don't consent to any searches." As Michael carefully opened his door and stepped out, he noticed for the first time that both officers had their body cameras activated. Small mercies. Hands on the hood, Reynolds ordered. Michael placed his palms on the warm metal of his car hood. Officers, I'd like to call my supervisor to verify my identity. Phones come later, Graves said, beginning a pat-down that felt more aggressive than necessary. If you're really who you say you are. This is completely unnecessary, Michael said, his professional composure starting to crack. You pulled me over for a taillight and now I'm being treated like a suspect. Is it standard procedure to have people exit their vehicles for equipment violations? Reynolds leaned in close. For people like you? Yeah, it is. The implication hung heavy in the night air. Michael felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd experienced subtle racism before, but this felt different. More overt, more dangerous. What exactly do you mean by people like me? Michael asked quietly. Troublemakers, Graves answered smoothly. People who think they're above the law. Michael took a deep breath. I enforce the law, officers. I'm not above it. Reynolds laughed. Sure you do. And I'm the Queen of England. When Graves finished the pat-down, he pulled Michael's phone from his pocket. Nice phone for a government employee. That's my personal property, Michael protested. I'd like it back so I can call my supervisor. Evidence, Reynolds declared without explanation. We need to check if it's stolen. Stolen? That's ridiculous. I've given you no reason to suspect me of any crime. Reynolds stepped closer, invading Michael's personal space. Your attitude is giving me plenty of reason to be suspicious. Real federal prosecutors know how to respect law enforcement. I've been nothing but respectful, Michael countered, his legal training warring with his growing indignation. But respect goes both ways, Officer Reynolds. The mention of his name seemed to anger Reynolds further. Get in the back of the patrol car. We're going to sort this out at the station. Michael stood his ground. Am I under arrest? If so, I'd like to know the charges. Impersonating a federal officer for starters, Graves said. Plus, we'll see what else we find. That's absurd. I am a federal prosecutor. You can verify. In the car, Reynolds interrupted, taking Michael's arm roughly. Now. As they guided him toward the patrol car, Michael noticed a passing vehicle slow down. The driver was clearly watching the scene unfold, perhaps even recording it. Michael made a mental note of the time and the car's description. Potential witnesses could be crucial later. This is completely inappropriate, Michael said as Reynolds opened the rear door of the police cruiser. I've cooperated fully, provided identification, and explained who I am. Save it for the station, Graves said dismissively. As Michael was placed in the back seat, he watched as Reynolds returned to his car. The officer rummaged through the case files on the passenger seat, flipping pages with casual disregard for confidential information. Michael leaned forward, speaking loudly, enough for the officer's body cameras to pick up his words. Those are federal case files. You have no authority to search them without a warrant. Neither officer acknowledged him. Instead, they exchanged words he couldn't hear, occasionally glancing back at him with undisguised contempt. Through the window, Michael watched Reynolds collect more of his belongings from the car, his briefcase, his laptop bag, even the travel mug sitting in his cup holder. None of these items had anything to do with a broken taillight. As the officers returned to the patrol car, Michael's professional training took over. He began mentally documenting every detail of the encounter, times, exact words used, actions taken. If these officers were going to abuse their authority, he would ensure there would be consequences. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving Michael's vehicle alone on the side of the road. As they drove toward the precinct, Michael sat, silently in the back seat, his mind already preparing the legal battle ahead. These officers had no idea what they had just done, or who they were really dealing with. In just a few hours, their entire world would be turned upside down. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct hummed overhead, as Officers Reynolds and Graves led Michael Chen through the station doors. The night shift was quiet, with only, a handful of officers manning the desks. Michael walked with his head held high despite the circumstances, his eyes taking in every detail. The security cameras in the corners, the duty roster on the wall, the faces of potential witnesses. Look what we caught tonight, Reynolds announced loudly as they entered, drawing attention from the other officers. Guy claims he's some hotshot federal prosecutor. A desk sergeant looked up from his computer. Oh yeah? Got all the fancy ID and everything, Graves added with a smirk. Real professional con man. Michael kept his expression neutral. I've asked repeatedly to make a phone call to verify my identity. It's my right. The desk sergeant frowned slightly. Why not just let him call? Reynolds shrugged. All in good time. Need to process him first. They led Michael to a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs. It wasn't technically an interrogation room. Those were likely in the back of the building, but it served the same purpose for initial processing. Sit, Graves ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. Michael complied, watching as Reynolds dropped his confiscated belongings on the table: wallet, keys, phone, and federal credentials. The officers left the room, closing the door behind them, but not locking it. Through the small window in the door, Michael could see them standing just outside, talking. His phone sat tantalizingly close on the table, but he knew better than to reach for it. Instead, he took the opportunity to study his surroundings. The room had a security camera in the upper corner. Good. More evidence of whatever was about to unfold. Outside the room, Reynolds and Graves were joined by 2 more officers. Michael couldn't hear their conversation clearly, but their body language told him they were sharing what they thought was an amusing story. One of the new officers glanced through the window at Michael and laughed. After a few minutes, the door opened. Again, Reynolds entered, followed by an older officer with captain's bars on his uniform. The nameplate read, Captain Wilson. So this is our federal prosecutor? Wilson asked, looking Michael over with skepticism. That's right, sir, Michael replied, calmly. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen from the downtown office. If you'd allow me to make a phone call, we can clear this up immediately. Wilson picked up Michael's credentials from the table and examined them. Unlike Reynolds and Graves, he seemed to be taking a more careful look. These look authentic, Wilson admitted. Reynolds scoffed. Captain, we've seen plenty of fake IDs. Guy's driving around at midnight with a car full of confidential papers. Claims he's working late. Classic setup. I was working late, Michael explained patiently. I'm leading a task force on police misconduct in this district. The files in my car are case documents. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Reynolds' face hardened, and even Wilson looked more guarded. Police misconduct, huh? Reynolds said. Convenient story. Wilson handed the credentials back to Reynolds rather than to Michael. Process him properly. If he's telling the truth, we'll find out. If not, he let the implication hang in the air. After Wilson left, Reynolds leaned against the wall. Here, that we're going to process you. Officer Reynolds, Michael said evenly, you're making a serious mistake. The longer this goes on, the worse it will be for everyone involved. Is that a threat? Reynolds asked, stepping closer. It's a professional assessment, Michael replied. I'm trying to help you avoid compounding an already problematic situation. Reynolds laughed. Listen to him talk. Real lawyer speak. He turned to leave. Sit tight, Mr. Prosecutor. We've got paperwork to fill out. The door closed again, leaving Michael alone. Through the window, he could see Reynolds and Graves at a nearby desk, laughing as they filled out forms. Every so often, they would point in his direction, clearly embellishing their story for the benefit of other officers who stopped by. Minutes stretched into a half hour. Michael remained composed, though inside he was seething. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about abuse of power, racial profiling, and the exact kind of misconduct his task force was investigating. The irony wasn't lost on him. Through the partially open blinds of a nearby office, Michael could see Reynolds and Graves talking with Captain Wilson again. They had moved from the public area of the bullpen to what appeared to be Wilson's private office. Whatever tale they were spinning had become more serious. Another officer that Michael hadn't seen before approached the room and opened the door. Need to take your fingerprints, he said without introduction. On what charges? Michael asked. Impersonating a federal officer, the officer replied mechanically. Resisting arrest, interfering with police duties. I didn't resist anything, Michael objected, and I am a federal officer. The officer shrugged. Not my call, just following procedure. Michael allowed himself to be fingerprinted, knowing that each step in this farce was creating more evidence. His fingerprints would match those already in the federal system, confirming his identity. They were digging themselves deeper with every passing minute. After the fingerprinting, the officer left without returning Michael's belongings. Through the window, Michael watched as Reynolds returned to his desk and began typing at his computer, occasionally glancing toward the room with a self-satisfied smile. In Wilson's office, Michael could see Graves gesturing animatedly, clearly, recounting a version of events that bore little resemblance to reality. Wilson nodded along, occasionally looking concerned but making no move to investigate further. The security cameras kept recording, the digital clock on the wall kept ticking forward, and the paper trail kept growing. Eventually, Reynolds printed something from his computer and showed it to Graves, who nodded approvingly. They both signed the document, then took it to Wilson's office. More signatures, more official stamps, more lies being formalized into the system. Michael watched it all unfold with a growing sense of certainty that this precinct was exactly why his task force existed. The casual corruption, the willingness to falsify reports, the tribal mentality that closed ranks around bad behavior. It was all happening right in front of him. Reynolds returned to the room, this time with a formal charge sheet. Michael Chen, you are being charged with impersonating a federal officer, resisting arrest and obstruction of justice, he read in an official tone, clearly enjoying the moment. You will be transferred to central booking in the morning for arraignment. Officer Reynolds, Michael said quietly, I'm giving you one last opportunity to verify my identity before this goes any further. We've verified all we need to, Reynolds replied smugly. Your fancy fake ID doesn't impress us. Have you checked the federal database? Called the U.S. Attorney's Office? Performed even the most basic due diligence? Reynolds folded the charge sheet and tucked it into his pocket. Save it for your public defender if you can get one at this hour. As Reynolds turned to leave again, the desk phone outside rang. One of the night shift officers answered it, listened for a moment, then looked toward Wilson's office with a puzzled expression. Captain? The officer called out. There's someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office on line 1. Says it's urgent. Their bullpen fell suddenly quiet. Reynolds froze in the doorway. What did you say? Wilson called back, emerging from his office. U.S. Attorney's Office, sir. The caller says she's the U.S. Attorney herself, Catherine Harrison. She's asking about a Michael Chen. Reynolds slowly turned back toward Michael, the color draining from his face. Michael allowed himself the smallest of smiles. You might want to take that call, Captain. Wilson looked from Michael to Reynolds, then to the phone. Put it through to my office. As Wilson disappeared back into his office, the atmosphere in the precinct transformed. Officers who had been laughing at Michael's expense minutes earlier now looked uncertain. Graves hurried over to Reynolds, speaking in urgent whispers. Michael remained seated, his posture relaxed for the first time since being pulled over. The machinery of justice was finally turning in the right direction. Through the window, he could see Wilson's face growing increasingly pale as he spoke on the phone. The captain's eyes kept darting toward the processing room where Michael sat. Reynolds and Graves huddled by the desk, frantically reviewing the paperwork they had just filed. Their confident swagger had evaporated, replaced by nervous energy and growing panic. The night was far from over, but the tables had already begun to turn. In just 10 short minutes, everything had changed. And Michael knew that what came next would shake this precinct to its foundation. Captain Wilson's office door remained closed for 5 long minutes. Through the blinds, Michael could see the idea police captain pacing, his face growing increasingly pale as he clutched the phone to his ear. Outside in the bullpen, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Officers who had been laughing and joking earlier now moved with tense purpose, exchanging worried glances. Reynolds and Graves stood by Reynolds's desk, frantically reviewing the report they had just filed. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety. Graves kept running his hand through his hair while Reynolds repeatedly checked his watch, as if hoping time might somehow reverse itself. "This can't be happening," Graves whispered, loud enough for Michael to hear through the partially open door. "We need to fix this." Reynolds shook his head. "It's already in the system, we can't just delete it." When Captain Wilson's office door finally swung open, the entire precinct fell silent. Wilson's face was ashen as he slowly walked toward the processing room where Michael sat. He paused at Reynolds' desk, his voice low but intense. "Outside. Both of you. Now." Reynolds and Graves followed Wilson through a side door that led to what appeared to be a small courtyard used by officers for smoke breaks. Though Michael couldn't hear their conversation, the captain's body language told the story. Finger jabbing at chests, arms gesturing wildly, head shaking in disbelief. Inside the precinct, the remaining officers moved with new urgency. One approached Michael's room, opened the door, and awkwardly cleared his throat. "Sir, can I get you some water or coffee?" The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the dismissive attitude, replaced by something approaching deference. "Water would be fine, thank you," Michael replied evenly. "And I'd appreciate the return of my personal belongings." "Of course, sir. Right away." Minutes later, Michael had his wallet, keys, and credentials back, though his phone remained conspicuously absent. The officer who returned his items couldn't quite meet his eyes. Through the courtyard window, Michael could see that Wilson's dressing down of Reynolds and Graves had escalated. The captain's face was flushed with anger as he pointed back toward the building. Reynolds attempted to speak, but Wilson cut him off with a sharp gesture. The side door opened, and Wilson marched back in with the two officers trailing behind him like scolded schoolchildren. "Mr. Chen," Wilson said, entering the processing room with forced composure, "there appears to have been a misunderstanding." "Is that what we're calling it?" Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. "A misunderstanding?" Wilson swallowed hard. "I've just spoken with U.S. Attorney Catherine Harrison. She's on her way here now with proper identification verification and FBI agents," Michael finished for him. "Standard procedure when a federal prosecutor is unlawfully detained." Reynolds and Graves stood in the doorway, their earlier swagger replaced by visible dread. Reynolds kept opening and closing his fists while Graves stared fixedly at the floor. "This is completely unnecessary," Wilson said, a note of pleading entering his voice. "We can resolve this internally." "That time has passed, Captain," Michael said, standing up for the first time since being brought in. "The moment your officers decided to falsify reports and file fraudulent charges, this became a federal matter." Wilson's face tightened. "They made a mistake in judgment." "A mistake?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "Is that also what we're calling the racial comments? The excessive force? The deliberate refusal to verify my identity? The falsification of official police documents?" Reynolds stepped forward, his demeanor completely transformed. "Sir, if I could explain—" "I believe your body camera footage will explain everything." Michael cut him off. "Assuming it hasn't mysteriously malfunctioned or been deleted." The look that flashed between Reynolds and Graves confirmed Michael's suspicion. "Tampering with evidence is another federal offense," Michael added quietly. "As I'm sure you're aware." Wilson turned to the two officers. "Tell me you didn't mess with the footage." Neither man answered directly. Reynolds looked away, while Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Jesus Christ," Wilson muttered, running a hand over his face. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before either officer could respond, a commotion at the front of the precinct drew everyone's attention. The night shift officer at the front desk stood up abruptly as the main door swung open. U.S. Attorney Catherine Harrison strode in, her presence commanding immediate respect despite the late hour. She was flanked by two FBI agents in suits, their expressions professionally neutral but their purpose unmistakable. "Where is he?" Harrison demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. The desk officer pointed toward the processing room, and Harrison locked eyes with Michael through the window. The relief on her face quickly gave way to controlled anger as she assessed the situation. "Michael," she said as she entered the room. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Catherine," he assured her, "though I've been better." Harrison nodded, then turned her attention to Captain Wilson. "I understand you've been holding my assistant U.S. attorney for the past 2 hours on false charges." Wilson straightened his posture. "There was a misunderstanding." "About his identity, ma'am." "A misunderstanding that somehow resulted in official charges being filed?" Harrison asked, her tone razor-sharp. "Despite multiple attempts by Mr. Chen to verify his identity?" "The officers involved showed poor judgment," Wilson admitted. "I take full responsibility as their commanding officer." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Captain, I appreciate the gesture, but responsibility lies with every individual who participated in this farce." She turned her attention to Reynolds and Graves, including officers who chose to falsify reports and potentially tamper with evidence. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "We'll need all body camera footage, precinct surveillance, and the official reports filed tonight." Reynolds finally found his voice. "Ma'am, this was just a routine traffic stop that escalated because Mr. Chen was uncooperative." The room fell silent. Michael looked at Reynolds with genuine surprise at the officer's continued attempt to shift blame. Harrison smiled thinly. "Officer, are you aware that Mr. Chen leads our task force investigating police misconduct in this district?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." "Are you aware that every case file you rummaged through in his car contains evidence related to that investigation?" "No, ma'am," Reynolds repeated, his voice barely audible. "And are you aware that Mr. Chen was actually on his way to meet with me tonight to discuss findings specifically related to this precinct?" This last claim was a fabrication, but Michael kept his face carefully neutral. Harrison was establishing dominance in the room, and it was working brilliantly. Reynolds looked like he might be sick. "The files," Graves spoke up suddenly. "They're still in the patrol car." Harrison nodded to one of the FBI agents, who immediately left to retrieve Michael's belongings. The second agent was already working, with the precinct's tech officer, to secure all digital evidence. Captain Wilson attempted to salvage what little dignity remained. "U.S. Attorney Harrison, I want to assure you that this incident doesn't reflect the values of our precinct. We're prepared to offer a formal apology and—" "Captain," Harrison interrupted. "Save the speech. Right now, I'm more interested in facts than apologies." She turned to Michael. "I believe you've been denied your phone call. Would you like to make it now?" Michael nodded, accepting his phone from Harrison. He stepped to the corner of the room and dialed his direct team at the U.S. Attorney's office, keeping his voice low but ensuring that Reynolds and Graves could hear enough to understand the gravity of their situation. "Lisa, it's Michael. I need you to pull everything we have on Precinct 26. Yes, specifically Officers Reynolds and Graves. Add Captain Wilson to that list. Yes, tonight. And contact Judge Peterson about emergency warrants for their personal communications." There was no Judge Peterson, and Michael had no authority to request such warrants without proper procedure. But the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Graves leaned against the wall for support while Reynolds finally broke. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "This will end my career. I have a family." Michael ended his call and turned back to face the room. "You should have thought about that before you decided I was lying about who I am." Harrison stepped closer to the two officers. "Gentlemen, I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your next steps. Cooperation might be the only thing standing between you and federal charges." The transformation was complete. The same officers who had swaggered and boasted just an hour earlier now stood defeated, their faces masks of regret and fear. As if to punctuate the moment, the FBI agent returned with Michael's case files and laptop. "Everything appears to be intact, sir." Michael nodded his thanks, then addressed the room. "The night's still young. I suggest we move this conversation to the U.S. Attorney's office where we can properly review all the evidence." Wilson looked at his watch, then at his officers, then back at Harrison. "At this hour?" Harrison's smile was without warmth. "Justice doesn't keep bankers' hours, Captain, and neither do we." As they prepared to leave, Michael caught Reynolds' eye. The officer who had been so dismissive, so certain of his power, now looked broken. His earlier words echoed back. For people like you? Yeah, it is. People like Michael Chen, assistant U.S. attorney and dedicated public servant, were indeed treated differently. Just not in the way Reynolds had imagined. The U.S. attorney's office looked different at night. The usually bustling hallways were silent. The overhead lights dimmed to half power, creating long shadows across the polished floor. Catherine Harrison led the procession through the security doors, her badge granting access to areas that would normally be restricted after hours. Behind her walked Michael Chen, still in the same suit he'd worn all day, though now wrinkled from his ordeal. Following them were the two FBI agents, professionally detached but vigilant. And bringing up the rear, looking increasingly uncomfortable with each step, came Captain Wilson and Officers Reynolds and Graves. Conference Room 3, Harrison directed, pointing down the hallway. It's already been set up. The large conference room had indeed been prepared despite the late hour. A technical team was waiting, computers and monitors ready. The wall-mounted screens displayed the precinct logo, a reminder of why they were all here. Gentlemen, please take a seat, Harrison instructed the police officers as she closed the door behind them. Wilson, Reynolds, and Graves sat on one side. Of the long table, their police authority diminished in this federal building. Michael and Harrison took positions opposite them, while the FBI agents stood by the door. One of the tech specialists approached Harrison with a tablet. We've secured all the digital evidence, ma'am. Body cam footage, precinct surveillance, dash cam, and the official reports. Thank you, Tom, Harrison replied. Let's start with the body cam footage. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ma'am, if I could explain the footage first, Harrison cut him off. Then explanations. The technician tapped a few commands, and the wall screens came to life. Multiple angles appeared simultaneously. Reynolds's body camera, Graves's body camera, and their patrol car's dash cam. The footage began at the moment they first spotted Michael's car. The officer's conversation was clearly audible. Late night, tinted windows, nice car. Reynolds's voice came through the speakers. Want to check it out? Sure, Graves replied. Taillight looks fine to me, but we can say it's out. Michael kept his expression neutral as the footage confirmed what he already knew. There had never been any legitimate reason for the traffic stop. Captain Wilson's face darkened as he watched, his earlier defense of his officers becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The video continued, showing the stop from multiple angles. The racial comments that Reynolds had made were now playing back for everyone to hear, his dismissive tone and body language evident. The excessive force during the pat-down, the unlawful seizure of Michael's phone and documents, all of it captured in high definition. When the footage reached the moment where Reynolds claimed Michael was being detained for impersonating a federal officer, Harrison paused the playback. Officer Reynolds, she said quietly. At this point, had you made any attempt to verify Mr. Chen's identity? Reynolds stared at the frozen image on the screen. No, ma'am. Did you call the number on his business card? No. Did you contact the federal database to check his credentials? No. Did you run his name through your own system, which would have shown his status? Reynolds swallowed hard. No, ma'am. Harrison nodded to the technician, who resumed the playback. The footage now showed the precinct, capturing Reynolds and Graves as they boasted to their colleagues about catching a con artist. The security cameras picked up their laughter, the embellishment of their story, the casual racism that peppered their comments. Most damning of all was the footage of Reynolds at his computer typing the official report. The precinct's security camera, positioned to monitor the bullpen, had a clear view of his screen as he wrote blatant falsehoods, claiming that Michael had been belligerent, that he had resisted arrest, that they had found suspicious materials in his vehicle. When the evidence presentation concluded, the room fell into heavy silence. Reynolds stared at his hands. Graves looked like he might be sick. Wilson sat rigidly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Officer Reynolds, Harrison finally spoke. Officer Graves, Would either of you care to explain what we just watched? Reynolds cleared his throat. It was a misunderstanding that got out of hand. A misunderstanding, Harrison repeated. Is that also how you would characterize the deliberate falsification of an official police report? I made a mistake, Reynolds admitted, his voice barely audible. Several, actually, Harrison corrected. Filing false charges, unlawful detention, racial profiling, evidence tampering when you attempted to disable your body cameras. Shall I continue? No, ma'am, Reynolds whispered. Harrison turned her attention to Captain Wilson. And you, Captain? How do you explain your role in all this? Wilson straightened in his chair. I should have verified Mr. Chen's identity immediately. I failed in my duty as their commanding officer. Yes, you did, Harrison agreed. But more concerning is what this incident reveals about the culture in your precinct. This isn't just about two officers making a mistake. This is systemic. She tapped a command on her tablet, and the screens changed to display a statistical breakdown of Precinct 26's arrest records, traffic stops, and complaints. Your precinct has the highest rate of racial disparities in traffic stops in the entire district, Harrison noted. Complaints about officer misconduct are routinely dismissed without investigation, and your own internal affairs unit hasn't issued a single finding against an officer in 3 years. She looked directly at Wilson. Care to explain that? Wilson had no answer. Michael, who had remained silent throughout most of the presentation, finally spoke. What you've witnessed tonight isn't an isolated incident. It's exactly why our task force exists. He stood and walked to the screens, bringing up files from his own investigation. These are complaints from just the past 6 months. Citizens who were profiled, harassed, or falsely charged by officers from Precinct 26. Many of them couldn't afford lawyers to fight back. Most were pressured into plea deals for crimes they didn't commit. All of them were people of color. Reynolds and Graves couldn't meet his gaze. The difference, Michael continued, is that those citizens didn't have the advantage of being federal prosecutors. They didn't have the U.S. attorney on speed dial. They didn't have FBI agents who would show up in the middle of the night to secure evidence. The weight of his words hung in the air. For the first time, real shame, not just fear of consequences, showed on the officers' faces. Harrison stood up. Gentlemen, here's what happens next. You are all currently suspended from duty, effective immediately. Your badges and service. Weapons will be surrendered before you leave this building. Captain Wilson started to protest, but Harrison held up her hand. This is non-negotiable, Captain. By morning, Internal Affairs from downtown will be taking control of your precinct for a full investigation. Every case handled by Officers Reynolds and Graves over the past 5 years will be reviewed. Reynolds finally broke. Please, he begged, his earlier arrogance completely gone. This will destroy everything I've worked for. I have a mortgage, kids in college. You should have considered that, Harrison replied, not unkindly, but firmly. Actions have consequences, Officer Reynolds. We made a mistake, Graves joined in, his voice cracking. Everyone deserves a second chance. Michael, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. Is that the same second chance you gave to Anthony Willis? He pulled up another file on the screen. A young black college student arrested by Reynolds and Graves last year on fabricated drug charges. His scholarship was revoked, his future destroyed. Did you think about his mortgage or his kids when you planted evidence in his car? The officers had no response. Or Teresa Lopez. Michael continued, displaying another case file. Single mother of 3, lost her job and her apartment after you falsely arrested her for shoplifting. Where was her second chance? Reynolds buried his face in his hands. Harrison placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, sensing his growing anger. I think they understand, Michael. She turned back to the officers. In addition to the Internal Affairs investigation, the Justice Department will be conducting a parallel civil rights investigation into Precinct 26. You will all be required to cooperate fully. Wilson found his voice at last. And if we do cooperate? What then? Harrison exchanged a look with Michael before answering. That depends on what we find, Captain. Best case scenario, mandatory retraining, probation, and community service for your officers. Worst case? Criminal charges and the end of your careers in law enforcement. The reality of their situation finally seemed to hit home. Reynolds, who had been so confident and dismissive just hours earlier, broke down completely, tears streaming down his face. "I can't lose everything," he sobbed. "Please, there must be something we can do. Anything." Michael watched the man who had humiliated him, who had made assumptions based solely on the color of his skin, now reduced to begging. There was no satisfaction in it, only a profound sadness at the waste of potential, at the lives damaged by such abuse of power. "There is something," Michael said quietly. "The truth. Start with that." Reynolds looked up, his eyes red. "What do you mean?" "A full accounting," Michael explained. "Every falsified report, every case where you cut corners or let bias influence your actions, every time you looked the other way when fellow officers crossed the line. You want us to turn on our own?" Wilson asked incredulously. "I want you to serve the public," Michael corrected him, "the way you swore to do when you took your oath." Harrison nodded her approval. Genuine cooperation could make a significant difference in how this proceeds. The three men exchanged glances, the weight of their choices, past and future, visible on their faces. "We'll cooperate," Wilson finally said, the fight gone from his voice. "Whatever you need." As the night stretched toward dawn, the truth began to emerge, one painful admission at a time. For Michael, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about finally bringing accountability to a system that had operated unchecked for far too long. The coup. Road ahead would be difficult, but tonight had been a start. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since that long night at the police precinct. Michael Chen sat at his desk in the U.S. Attorney's office, reviewing the latest reports from the Internal Affairs investigation. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust particles in golden beams, a stark contrast to the fluorescent gloom of that fateful evening. A knock at his door pulled his attention away from the documents. Catherine Harrison stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you could use this," she said, placing 1 cup on his desk. "You've been at it since dawn." Michael smiled gratefully. "Thanks. Hard to believe it's only been 2 weeks. Feels like months." "That's what happens when you start turning over rocks," Harrison replied, taking a seat opposite him. "All kinds of things crawl out. The investigation into Precinct 26 had revealed far more than anyone anticipated. What began with 2 officers and a captain had expanded to include a dozen more officers, revealing a pattern of misconduct that spanned years. False arrests, racial profiling, evidence tampering. The list grew daily as more victims came forward and more officers chose cooperation over obstruction. "How are you holding up?" Harrison asked, studying Michael's face. The incident had taken a toll despite his professional demeanor. "I'm fine," he said automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, that's not entirely true. It's been challenging. More than I expected." Harrison nodded, understanding. "It's different when you're not just the prosecutor but also the victim." "That's just it," Michael replied, setting down the report. "I keep thinking about all the other victims who didn't have my resources, my connections, people who went to jail because of Reynolds and his partners." "That's why the work you're doing is so important," Harrison reminded him. "Anthony Willis is being offered a full scholarship reinstatement. Teresa Lopez is getting her record expunged and receiving compensation. You're making real difference here." Michael nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "The police chief wants to meet today. Says he has a proposition." "Do you want me there?" Harrison asked. "No, I think I can handle this one," Michael replied with a small smile. "But thanks for the offer." Later that morning, Police Chief Richard Thomas arrived at the U.S. Attorney's office. Unlike Captain Wilson, who had been placed on administrative leave, Thomas had a reputation as a reformer. He'd been brought in from another city specifically to clean up the department's image after a previous scandal. Michael welcomed him into his office, offering coffee, which the chief declined. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, Mr. Chen, Thomas began, taking a seat, especially given your recent experience with our department. It's my job, Chief Thomas, Michael replied simply. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. Thomas leaned forward. Your experience, while deeply regrettable, has created an opportunity. Michael raised an eyebrow. An opportunity? For real change, Thomas clarified. Not just punishing the officers involved, but transforming how we operate as a department. The chief pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. I've drafted a comprehensive reform proposal, new training protocols, community oversight, body camera policies with actual consequences for violations. He paused. But for it to work, I need someone who understands both sides of the system. Someone the officers can't dismiss as just another bureaucrat. Michael opened the folder, skimming the contents. You want me to be involved in training your officers? More than that, Thomas said. I want you to lead it. A joint task force between your office and our department. Full access, full authority to implement changes. Michael sat back in his chair, studying the chief's face for any sign of insincerity. He found none. Why me? He asked simply. After what happened, wouldn't my involvement just create more resentment among your officers? Thomas smiled ruefully. Some, certainly. But that's exactly why it needs to be you. The old guard needs to understand that the times have changed, and the good officers, and there are many, need to see that we're serious about reform. Michael considered the proposal. It was bold, potentially transformative, but it would also mean working directly with people who had humiliated and defamed him. What about Reynolds and Graves? He asked. And the others implicated in the investigation? That's up to the disciplinary board, and ultimately the courts, Thomas replied. But I believe in consequences that lead to change, not just punishment. If you're asking my personal opinion, I think some will never wear the badge again. Others might find a path to redemption through accountability and service. Michael nodded slowly. I'll need time to consider this. Of course, Thomas said, rising to leave. But don't take too long. The momentum for change won't last forever. After the chief departed, Michael sat alone in his office, turning over the proposal in his mind. His phone buzzed with a text message from Harrison. How did it go? Instead of responding immediately, Michael picked up his keys. He needed to clear his head. 30 minutes later, Michael pulled into the parking lot of Precinct 26. The building looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less intimidating. He sat in his car for several minutes, gathering his thoughts before finally stepping out. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. Most of the officers he passed avoided eye contact, though a few nodded acknowledgement. The internal affairs team had set up a command center in what used to be Wilson's office, and several officers were being interviewed in the conference rooms. Michael made his way to the break room, where he'd been told Reynolds would be on his lunch break. The officer who had once swaggered with such unearned confidence now sat alone, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the table before him. Reynolds looked up as Michael entered, surprise quickly followed by shame crossing his face. He started to rise. Don't get up, Michael said quietly. This isn't an official visit. Reynolds sank back down. Why are you here then? Good question, Michael admitted, taking a seat across from him. I'm still figuring that out myself. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. I've been suspended, Reynolds finally said, his voice subdued. Pending the investigation, they'll probably fire me. Probably, Michael agreed. Given the evidence, that seems like the minimum consequence. Reynolds nodded, accepting the truth of it. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I am sorry. Not just for what happened to you, but for everything. Everything being what, exactly? Michael pressed. Reynolds looked up, meeting Michael's gaze for the first time. The way I've done my job, the people I've hurt, the times I looked the other way when I should have spoken up. Michael studied the man before him, searching for any sign of the arrogant officer who had pulled him over that night. He found only a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. Chief Thomas has proposed a reform program, Michael said. Training, oversight, accountability. He's asked me to lead it. Reynolds looked surprised. Are you going to do it? I haven't decided, Michael admitted. It would mean working with officers who might resent me, some of whom might have been involved in the misconduct we're investigating. The good ones won't resent you, Reynolds said quietly. They'll welcome the change, and the bad ones. He shrugged. Well, they need to change or find another job. Michael was struck by the transformation. Which category do you fall into, Reynolds? The officer was quiet for a long moment. I want to believe I could be one of the good ones, that I could learn, do better. But honestly, I don't know if I deserve that chance. For the first time, Michael felt something besides anger toward the man. Not forgiveness, it was too soon for that, but perhaps the first seed of understanding. That's not for me to decide, Michael said, standing up. But I do know this. Real change doesn't come from punishing people. It comes from transforming systems. As Michael left the precinct, his decision was already taking shape. The path forward wasn't about vengeance or even justice for a single incident. It was about building something better from the broken pieces of a flawed system. 3 months later, Michael stood at a podium in the Police Academy auditorium. Behind him sat Chief Thomas, Catherine Harrison, and representatives from community organizations across the city. Before him sat the newest class of police cadets, along with officers from precincts throughout the district, including some from Precinct 26. Today marks the beginning of a new approach to policing in our community, Michael began. One based, not just on enforcement, but on empathy. Not just on authority, but on accountability. In the back row he spotted Reynolds, no longer an officer, but present as part of his community service requirement. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. What happened to me was not unique, Michael continued. My story gained attention because of my position, but countless others have suffered similar or worse treatment without the ability to seek recourse. He gestured to the community members behind him. These leaders represent those voices. In the coming weeks, you'll hear directly from people affected by police misconduct, not to shame you, but to help you understand the real impact of your actions and decisions. As Michael outlined the new training program, implicit bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, community engagement requirements, he felt a cautious optimism. The road ahead would be difficult, change would be slow and resistance inevitable. But watching the faces of the young cadets, eager to serve for the right reasons, he believed real transformation was possible. What had begun as a night of humiliation and anger had transformed into something unexpected, an opportunity to create lasting change, not through vengeance or retribution, but through the harder, more meaningful work of reform. For Michael Chen, that was justice in its truest form.